Welcome to a special Navigating Net Zero mini-series. Navigating Net Zero in Focus, Developments in Climate Standards and Guidance. In this mini-series, your host Alexia Kelly sits down with the leadership of many of the foremost climate accounting and reporting bodies to get the latest on this fast-moving, sometimes confusing space. Together, they get to the bottom of what each of these standards does, what they're doing to rise to the moment, and why it's so important to get all of this right. Thanks for joining us. Let's dive right in.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Alexia Kelly, your host here at Navigating Net Zero, the podcast where we talk about what's happening, what's working, what's not, what's next on the global journey to net zero. I'm delighted to be joined here today with Amy Brachio, the CEO of Carbon Measures and a leading voice on the future of corporate sustainability. After nearly 3 decades at EY, including serving as Global Vice Chair for Sustainability there, she has helped shape how some of the world's largest companies approach climate risk, business resilience, and sustainability performance. Today, she's focused on advancing the measurement and data systems that underpin credible climate action, an issue that is near and dear to my heart and a topic that seems to be at the tip of everyone's tongues these days in the sustainability space. So, Amy, wonderful to have you here. Thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
So tell me a little bit just about your personal journey and why you decided to make this leap into this big new initiative called Carbon Measures, which has caused quite a stir in the greenhouse gas accounting and sustainability space.
Great. Thanks so much. Alexia, as you mentioned, I spent 30 years at EY. I'm a certified public accountant by background. I served in a number of different roles at EY, but what I always loved is where market opportunity and purpose came together. So when I had the chance to be EY's Global Vice Chair of Sustainability, I couldn't have been more excited to step into that role. But one of the things that struck me as I worked with our clients was that it was not a shortage of ambition that was holding organizations back. It was, you can continue to invest in everything that we need companies to invest in, but if you don't have buyers on the other side that are buying at the right scale, you're never going to see the impact at the scale and the pace that we need. So when I hit 30 years, there was just something about the 30 years from when I interned, and it hit at the same time that my younger daughter graduated from undergrad. So my husband and I both felt like this could be a time to do something different. And at the time I made the decision, I had no idea what I was going to do. But then this opportunity came my way that was business-led, and I've been in business my whole career, required accounting expertise, and I'm a CPA, and was focused on solving the problem that I saw as a major obstacle to change. And I just couldn't be more excited to take it on.
Well, it's certainly important work. And I know many people appreciate you staying in the fight because I know certainly at that point in your life, your husband might have had something in mind that looked less like working 8 hours a week and more like traveling the world and enjoying. So hopefully that's on the horizon as well once we get this greenhouse gas accounting space sorted out.
Exactly.
So tell us a little bit more about Carbon Measures. What was its origin story? What is it working to do? And we'll come back to this question of regulatory versus voluntary action, because that's a theme that crosscuts a lot of the conversations we're having, and I think is really central to thinking through how we navigate this next decade or so of action.
Yeah. So the origin story is that I think a lot of different organizations had been thinking through the fact that while absolute progress has been made with respect to reducing carbon emissions, and we know that we are on a different trajectory than we would have been before the Paris Accord, before the strong commitments that companies made, but that we're not going to get all the way where we need to go with that alone. And so then the challenge is, what can you do to drive the alignment between market incentives, which really is what drives corporate behavior, and the actions that need to be taken to reduce carbon emissions? And so 4 companies got together to say, is this something that others in, the ecosystem and in industry would get behind? And so a lot of the leadership came from Ana Botín at Banco Santander, from Darren Woods at ExxonMobil, but also Leon Tanapolin at Nucor and Francois Jacot from Air Liquide. And they, as through the World Economic Forum's International Business Council, got together with other CEOs and said, what is it going to take in order for us to be able to drive a change with respect to the alignment? And so then that's where the forming really started. And what was the focus was on, if we're going to unlock demand for these products that we need. And when I say products, I don't mean a tube of toothpaste. What I mean is steel, cement, the fuel that goes into the grid, that, the different fuels that support transport, cement, steel, chemicals, ammonia, those products at the beginning of the value chain that drive about 70% of the emissions. So first of all, you need a target that you have to hit. And I know we'll get into voluntary and mandatory, but at a product level, companies are very used to having to hit a product target. And so when you think about all of the health and safety requirements out there, we can't buy a car without a seatbelt, right? And companies have to have seatbelts in their cars, and so they need to do that. When we looked at how we solved the ozone layer issue, how we got sulfur out of fuels, it was because there were rules with respect to, you can't do this. And we want to have that same, where you've got product intensity standards at the right point in the value chain that consider trade, competitiveness, affordability, and emissions reduction. And then a curve that drives it down over time, such that you can't sell into a given market if you don't hit it. If you're going to do that, though, you then need the data that's going to underpin a contract and regulatory compliance and can flow across the value chain. And to get there, you need a bit more specificity than we have in the system today. And you need comparability. And in many of the areas, there's options with respect to how you do the measurements. And so that's what we were set up to achieve. We launched back in October with 19 companies. We're up to 26. We have good line of sight to 30 and a great pipeline of others who are reaching out to join us. And then I know we'll talk more about where we go next, but that's our focus.
And maybe just for the record, give us the what is Carbon Measure's kind of elevator pitch. And and then we'll dig into the details because you touched on a bunch of points that I want to come back to.
We were set up to ensure that we align market incentives to the actions that need to be taken to drive down carbon emissions. We are set up to advocate for carbon intensity standards and to develop the accounting framework that underpins that. Now, when I say all of that, we don't intend to be around forever. When we finished our job, we will be done. And so that means that we've got to be wildly collaborative with others to be able to get to the point where policymakers are enacting laws. And we've put an accounting framework in place that operates at the level of generally accepted accounting principles, IFRS, and that's the way you do it with respect to carbon intensity.
Such an important point. And I think this is one of the areas where there's a lot of confusion. And I know you bring a lot of expertise to the table. So let's dig in on the greenhouse gas accounting first.
Yeah.
Because it matters so much, right? It really is the sort of heart of the conversation. There are obviously lots of initiatives and standards out there around product level intensity measurement. We now have obviously regulation being implemented through the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism in the EU around product level intensity. So I would say that this space has evolved really quickly and pretty significantly. And also, there's a lot of work to do, I think, around the alignment across key standards. So talk a little bit about the work you're doing on the methodological front and really figuring out, like, what are the right methodologies for calculating those? Because I understand that you're actually in the process of developing your own proposed approaches.
Yeah, so think about us as, I learned this term recently, a coordinating device, right? I mean, you are so right in saying that there are a lot of different efforts out there. And the problem is that when you get to something that can underpin a contract and flow across the value chain, you've got to have comparability and verification. So just an example to bring it to life, I was talking to a woman responsible for sustainability at an aluminum company. She has to calculate the carbon intensity of her product in different ways depending on the preference of their buyer, right? And so it is the same aluminum, it is the same factory, the same process. And I'm not saying that any of these approaches are necessarily wrong, so to speak. But if you don't have a consistent approach, you can't have it flow. You add aluminum to steel to concrete and you try to make some sense of it, and you're not going to be able to. So we teamed up with the International Chamber of Commerce, and we did that for a few reasons. First of all, they have 42 million members around the world. They had been hearing from their members that this was a problem that needed to be solved. They're in 170 countries. They have a long experience working through the COP process. And we came together to develop a technical expert panel to drive the development of the framework for this. We've got a nice mix across academia, nonprofits, and business. And we've got coverage across the world, and we've got coverage across sectors, and we bring together a lot of different expertise on the topic. And the first step of that process is to do a landscape analysis. And that work's actually underway today. And so one of the big questions is, what are the different things that we can draw from to bring together to bring this forward? And I don't have the answer to that yet because the work of the expert panel is underway. But we don't want to recreate anything that is good and working and adopted out there. What we want to do is bring it together in a cohesive way, identify where the specific breakpoints are that would get in the way of being able to drive it across the value chain in a generally accepted way. And I think one of the other things, and we'll probably get into the ledger-based approach to think about it, is a lot of the work that's been done today is that ledger is within an organization. And we need to make sure that this data can flow across organizations and across the value chain in a way that's cohesive.
Yeah, I think that is true. And we are, I think, looking ahead in one of those periods of time for the market where convergence is necessarily the path forward.
Yeah.
The question, of course, then becomes like, what are we converging around?
Yeah.
And who is managing that convergence process? And I think actually the ICBC, the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, is a really interesting example of how that convergence is occurring organically across the sector, where, we had a high degree and a large number of super fragmented standard setting bodies that were addressing different parts of the market, had their own regulatory development processes in place. And what we've been working through systematically is, okay, how do we take that next step to really think about this from a global threshold benchmark level so that we have one comparable set of methodologies for specific project types that are particularly relevant. And I hear that from financial and institutional investors a lot, that the fact that we have so many versions of different methodologies to do the same core function in the market is a real impediment to both an orderly sort of management of the space over time, right? Like you have to have a good governance system. I think this is all complicated by the fact that we don't have a really good international governance system for this set of issues. And so we're in this sort of messy, organic, slow consolidation around who can bring the resources to the table and who's sort of able and willing to move the ball down the court.
Yeah. And I think your point is a really good one. And what I would add to it is that when we're thinking about how things come together, what's really important is to think about the problem that you're trying to solve, or what is the theory of change that this data is underpinning. I mean, I think you and I both come from quantitative backgrounds. We know better data, better decisions, and that's great. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is very specifically create the data that's going to be required to underpin transactions. You can put it on your invoice. And when someone is buying it, it is in the contract that it represents the carbon intensity of what you were selling, and that it is fit for purpose for regulatory compliance. Because when you have these types of regulations in place, there will be compliance monitoring and likely fines or things like that associated with non-compliance. And so the companies that are buying your goods need to make sure that that data is done in a way that it's going to meet the regulatory standards. And when you look at the products that we're really focused on by way of carbon measures, these are globally traded. And so you can't have a system that it's one calculation here and another one there and another one there and make any sense of it.
Yeah, and I think that's a key barrier that we're going to have to sort out. I want to come to this question of sort of financial market alignment and assurability, because that's a point that you and others have been making pretty consistently. I think there's a lot of confusion around what does that actually mean and what about the current system, because we do have standards for all of these things right now, right? Like, where is the current system falling short with respect to that level of financial assurance as a former assurer? Like, help us understand what that gap looks like right now.
And I'm not going to say that there is no data produced today that is produced in a way that couldn't meet what I'm talking about. So I think that there are a couple of things to think about. First of all, it gets to this global consistency. And again, there are a number of different methodologies that are used in a way that you could argue global consistency, but it's not a mandated approach necessarily at this level. And you still have options, right? So different companies choose to calculate in their own way. Different product categories have their own standards, and they're not necessarily the same. So a lot of what's been developed out there today is more of a recipe for the calculation and looking at things in a way that it could be adopted by multiple product categories. And then the companies have some optionality in how they apply it or some subjectivity. And I'm not saying that financial accounting has solved everything on all of these topics. But for financial accounting, when you're reading a net income from one statement to a net income from another statement, you know how it was calculated. And that's the level that we're trying to get down to. And it's as much about right now that you don't have the comparability in the system as it is some of these other topics. And so that's why learning from what's good out there and then helping to lift it up and get to this is the approach that we're going to take is what's so important. And I think like the next question I get is, well, Amy, people have been trying this for a really long time. Why do you think that you can do it, relative to others? And I think that, like you mentioned, this is a moment in time where I think that many are looking for how do we get to like rationalized approach and like I talked about, the level of commitment to driving change running into the market incentives are saying we've got to look at this in another way, because especially when you're dealing with the types of companies that we're dealing with on this early side of the value chain, their planning horizons are so long. They are making investments today that 10, 20, 30 years from now need to be still delivering a return. And if we don't start to change this dynamic on incentives, we're never going to get the pace of change and the scale of change we need. And so we're going to continue to grow as an organization. But again, that was part of why teaming with the International Chamber of Commerce with their breadth and their history was so vitally important. And it doesn't mean that we wouldn't have opportunities to collaborate with others as well. I think as we start to develop this, it's going to be more and more we're saying, okay, you have done an amazing job here. How do we link that in? And then we want this adopted by broader standard setters. There's not going to be a carbon measures framework. It's the framework that we develop that we help get adopted by others.
I've shared with you in other conversations, and I know people have talked about, like, really, I think the environmental and climate sort of expert community judgment will be based on, what's in those methodologies, because that really is where the rubber hits the road in terms of delivering the environmental outcomes that we need. But generally, I think there's broad recognition that, we really do need to get more consolidated and start moving towards that next bar of financial market alignment and assurability. And it's interesting to hear you say the comparability. I've been doing a lot of work on this in the context of the carbon markets. And watching that sort of emerge has been really interesting, because what comes out is, actually, you just need less flexibility around this specific parameter and more detail here. And you need a provision to explicitly address fraud over here. And so in many instances, I think for some of the existing standards, like, it's really more about what are the surgical changes that we're making that would enable a Big Four auditor to come in and really start actually undertaking that assurance so that we can start to hit, hopefully, that reasonable assurance level that we hear is so important from a reporting perspective.
Yeah, but I do think this is where it's really, really important to think about the different objectives of different standards, right? Mm-hmm. And so When you step back, and I'm going to say this in a simple way that I'm sure others could say, like, there's more to think about. But when you step back at a big picture level, SBTI is so critically important because companies have made broad commitments with respect to sustainability, and someone trusted has to say that those are based in science, right? So that is a role to play. When you look broadly speaking at greenhouse gas protocol and what's been put into place to date, it is about understanding the risks at an enterprise level presented by greenhouse gas emissions, right? I mean, and that's actually when you go back to why it was stood up, that is in a lot of the work around what was behind it. When you look at what's done by CSRD or ISSB, it's about getting investors the data that they need in order to make risk decisions. And a lot of what's been done in the disclosures to date really is for the purpose of risk assessment. And for risk assessment, you need to be able to identify and be pointed in the right direction. And the better it is, the fewer red herrings you're chasing. But directionally correct works. To underpin a contract, it's got to be much more specific because of the compliance element. And I guess my ask for the environmental community, I consider myself part of the environmental community, but my ask though is we won't be successful unless we have both the regulations that we're advocating for that drive down emissions, plus the accounting. The accounting for us is a tool to be able to enable the regulation. And it's the combination of the two that drive down emissions. And it's also an and not an or. It doesn't mean that these other things aren't important to keep going and continue to drive down emissions. But I think that what we can do is help unlock the power of the market in a way that it hasn't been unlocked before.
Which is fine. And I think, there is certainly a risk assessment benefit and impact. I would actually argue that a lot of the standards and methodologies that we've developed in the greenhouse gas accounting space over the last 25 years are actually about measuring the impact of your activities and doing the best job we can to estimate those, recognizing that in most cases, we don't have primary data available.
I totally agree with you. But it's not underpinning a contract associated with the sale of a good.
Unless you're active in the carbon markets. But that's
unless you're 100%. And that's where this is like, this stuff is. So I totally agree with you in the carbon markets. And I think if you think back to some of the challenges earlier on in the carbon markets, it's a lot of the stuff you and I are talking about right now, the comparability, the validity of the data, the ability to assure the information. And we're trying to get to that same level of comparability when you think about it largely for the commodities at the beginning of the value chain.
Yep. Yeah, and I do want to talk about the beginning of the value chain concept because Carbon Measures has lots of heavy emitters in there.
Yes.
I know there's been a high degree of, let's just say, consternation about particularly the prominent role that Exxon has played in getting this stood up and off the ground. And, for the record, I, for one, would absolutely be delighted to see Exxon's formidable lobbying power directed towards getting comprehensive regulation around product level intensity standard or any other kind of emissions regulation and management requirements, we possibly can. Like, that would be an enormous win.
Yeah.
For all of us, having been on the receiving end of their lobbying prowess on more than one regulatory occasion over the course of my career. So it would be great if we could get aligned around something that we all say, yes, but just to ask the hard question, and the question that I get all the time, isn't this just about allowing heavy emitters to obviate their Scope 3 emissions responsibility? And this really sounds like a red herring in that, great, we're happy to engage. We want another decade of rulemaking around what the actual measurement systems look like. And then maybe we'll start talking about regulation because everything that's come before isn't good enough. Or we want the exact opposite of what we actually have done today.
Yeah, I'm going to answer in two different parts. So the first part, you asked me the origin story. And I had some different opportunities with respect to what I wanted to do next. And I had to think long and hard with respect to, which role that I took. And I have 3 adult daughters. And so I took this as a family decision. And one of the things I said is like, if I do this, there are going to be some articles about mom that you may not love. And so I just want to make sure that as a family, we are all good with that. And my youngest, I think, said it so well. And she said, if these are the companies that want to get in and drive change with respect to driving down emissions, which we all need, why wouldn't you work with them? And so that I was like, done. That was the final step in our decision. But on a more serious level, this is where I ask everyone to judge us based on our actions. And so when we look at regulation, we're not looking at it solely on an individual product by product basis. But one of the things that we've done is we've teamed up with Resources for the Future. They're a well-respected think tank in this area. And part of what we think has held back some of the progress that we could see is that when we're thinking about climate policy, putting together market competitiveness, growth, and climate in your modeling out of the policy is vitally important. And so we're looking at where in the value chain would you put these emission standards such that you're driving the most from a growth and an affordability standpoint, and you're driving the most from an emission standpoint. So one example I'll give you is like we're looking at how do you approach something like marine transport? Because what you could do is you could look at marine fuel or you could look at marine transport. And the two have very different outcomes, right? And so the marine transport, if you put it on, you can't have carbon intensity above a certain level for nautical mile shipped, ton shipped, whatever the right metric is. And that has to go down over time. That drives innovation in the vessel and innovation in the fuel source. Now, one thing that we are unapologetic about is that we are focused on reducing emissions. And we are not going to judge between one way to reduce emissions versus another, as long as the outcome is based in science, verifiable, and reduce. So you might have one company that figures out diesel and carbon capture, and you have another company that's ammonia and a sail on the vessel. And if it has the same emissions intensity per nautical mile shipped, it has the same, intensity, right?
Yep.
And so I do understand the questions that we get asked. But again, I think it's for us to demonstrate that we are as focused on driving the policy forward as we are the accounting side, and demonstrate that with pace.
Yeah, so talk a little bit about what that plan looks like and how that's evolving.
Yeah. So we are I do like to remind people that we're just over 6 months old. So I get a lot of questions about like the super detailed, but when you are building trust in something that you're doing, it is important to do the work, right? So I talked about like the landscape analysis that we're doing. We're doing technical deep dives into things that are out there from a accounting standpoint. And it's also really important that we do the work with respect to the policy. So that's the work with the Resources for the Future. But some of what we're looking at is, are there certain jurisdictions where we can test some things out? We've got global members that are part of what our members are willing to do is pilot the work that we're doing. And so work with policymakers with respect to how can we help to test this out on one product in your market with our members, such that we can demonstrate how to bring this policy to life. We will have more news about our approach to it, but it's a little premature right now.
I'll come back to you in a few months.
Yeah, I would love to do this again. Exactly.
Because I do think that is, there is nobody better at lobbying, right? And helping drive regulatory impact and outcomes.
We don't have just one member.
Of course.
We have 26. But what's been amazing is the commitment of our members across the board. And so we've stood up, different advisor groups and things like that, where our members come together and are really the ones that are helping us to be better and advance across multiple markets.
Totally. And I actually do want to come back, because I know in the conversations I've been having with folks about this work, this notion of efficiency and going upstream and impact is a really important one, as is the green premium and the cost delta, right? So when I was working to decarbonize my scope 3 and put that strategy together, I'm looking at this, long tail of very small, highly distributed, almost entirely estimated emission sources in a supply chain that changed all the time. I had very little control over. Like, there were real challenges to trying to push all of the action and decarbonization strategy downstream. I spent a lot of time thinking, gee, it would be way more efficient if we could go upstream and really focus on what are the big rocks from a technology deployment and implementation perspective that would help bring down emissions in a systematic way across an entire sector. So I am entirely aligned with that approach. And it's one that I think merits more serious consideration and discussion in our kind of broader theory of change conversations that we're having. And as we move into this next phase of strategic work, I think, around what does global decarbonization policy look like in a geopolitical landscape that is significantly more complicated, I think, than it's ever been, certainly in the history of my career.
Yeah. And so, I mean, that's exactly what we're trying to do. Like, I think about my old role, and at EY, we were very committed to driving down our own carbon emissions, right? But at the end of the day, it's a professional services firm. And we did a great job. I'm so proud to have been even a small part of it. But at the end of the day, for a company like that, it is make sure you've got renewables powering your offices and reduce your travel. But until jet fuel and jet transport gets addressed, there's not a whole lot more that can be done. And so if we can get these big rocks around transport and the built environment and chemicals on a really good trajectory, then everyone can be looking at where are they uniquely positioned to drive down emissions. Now, it's really important to say, because I think some people say, well, what you're doing then is, you're pushing the responsibility for the actual emissions down further the value chain. We're just looking at it in a different way. We're saying regulate it, right? Because then if you regulate the carbon emissions, it changes the demand signal for everything that comes before it. Because then you're going to actually be able to either charge a green premium or monetize your overperformance. Whereas today, I'm not going to say no one monetizes their overperformance, but at the scale that we need, we are not monetizing overperformance for reducing emissions.
I've been having a lot of conversations with folks. A lot of the attention has focused on the voluntary carbon market and voluntary action for corporates over the last few years, in part because I think we've been unsuccessful largely at getting global carbon pricing in place, particularly in key markets like the United States and frankly, even Canada, which has, carbon pricing, but it's variably implemented. We're not anywhere near where we had hoped we would be by now in terms of having that globally unified price on carbon that is sending the price signal that we really need to drive this deep decarbonization and transformation. So all for, let's figure out how we can get aligned on pushing for regulation. But a bunch of people come up to me and be like, we never really thought that voluntary action was the right answer. And our response is, yeah, no kidding. None of us did. This is not plan A. This is not even plan B. We're kind of in plan D territory at this point. So I would love it if we could sit down and have a really well-structured conversation with heavy emitters, with the fossil fuel industry, with these emitters that are frankly struggling, I think, to figure out how they justify these huge CapEx investments in retooling supply chains in an economic environment that really doesn't reward it. Right? Like, it is very difficult for them to actually get compensated back for that in our current economic system.
You've nailed the problem that we're trying to solve. So when I look at the common thread across the organizations that have joined us, it's that they understand the role that corporations play in driving down emissions. They have invested heavily in low carbon products and solutions, and they have not got the return that warrants continued investment. These are public companies that are beholden to their shareholders.
Yep.
And so we've got to change that dynamic or we're never going to see the change. Now, that doesn't mean that it's a this or that, right? Like, I think it's amazing, the voluntary commitments that companies have made. And I think when you look at the impact and the reduction, they've done a lot of work and we've seen a lot of results. But this is a systemic problem. And so if you think about that, we have focused a lot of our attention on innovating the products that are required to lower carbon emissions. We have not innovated the system that underpins allowing those to really thrive. And that's where we're more focused.
And we think it's incredibly important to maintain that focus on Scope 3 decarbonization. I've heard a lot of companies say, we never would have made the investments we've made in what are functionally upstream, heavy emissions, very expensive investments. Like, we never would have made those were it not for our Scope 3 targets and responsibility. So making sure that we are keeping companies accountable for Scope 3 is very, very important. And I know that's been something that we've talked about because of the way that, in particular, the e-ledgers concept is structured. And we're thinking about the Scope 1 focus. So maybe talk a little bit about how you're anticipating resolving that tension and how you see these things fitting together.
Yeah, I'm glad we're discussing it. Because one of the things is I feel like I need to do a better job articulating articulating our point of view on this. And I think it's because we are not necessarily thinking in scopes with respect to our theory of change. And now that doesn't mean that we are advocating that people don't think in those scopes. Like I said, this is going to take multiple tools. If you look at our parallel to financial statements, one financial statement doesn't answer all questions, right? There's a balance sheet, there's a cash flow statement, there's a financial statement.
Yep.
And there's no reason why we should think that there wouldn't be. But they're interoperable, right? You can do the math between one and the next in order to get the whole picture that you need. So what we're focused on is the emissions that went into producing that product. Now, if we were doing accounting alone, I can definitely understand the concern about, well, if all people have to do is, stop at the gate, right? If you say cradle the gate, then who has responsibility for, especially when you're talking about, oil and gas products, who has responsibility when the emission takes place? But our control and the pressure that we're putting into the system then is through the intensity standard. And so that's how you get responsibility, so to speak. But the responsibility comes from the demand signal and the fact that low carbon emission products are beneficial to that company that has to hit the standard, hitting their standard.
So the argument is that it really doesn't matter as much then when the end emission occurs or on whose books that end emission is showing up, because ostensibly you've addressed that with the emissions intensity standard.
Right. You won't be able to sell your product. Like, as that curve continues to go down, if you are selling a high emitting product and no one has figured out the carbon capture that needs to happen or how you address those emissions, your product is not going to be as valuable. So I think another way to think about what we're doing is, how do we help companies be profitable while they change their product portfolio mix to reduce emissions over time?
Yeah, and I think the product just framing might be where people are getting confused because, to your earlier point, like, you guys are really focusing upstream on the input. And really what you're proposing is a cap and trade like regulation, right? Maybe less formally organized and around emissions intensity product level standards as opposed to an absolute cap with an allocation system. But those systems typically are also administered upstream because that's the only, so emitters that emit more than 25,000 tons a year is typically what you see in cap and trade systems. So you would imagine that an intensity standard would be applied at the product level, but would have that knock-on effect,
right,
across all of the major emission sources. I think the question, of course, then becomes, what is that intensity level set at? How quickly is it declining? And how is it calculated and enforced, which I think is also a big challenge.
No, absolutely. And what we are taking out to do is not easy.
Right.
So that's where you have to come up with this curve that looks at what is the intensity standard and how does the intensity standard take into place in the competitiveness, the commodities that country has, the national endowments, and their commitments under the Paris Accord. Now, what we're doing does not get anyone to net zero on its own, right? More work has to be done, policies required around it. But if we can really tackle these heavy emitting products at the right point in the value chain, it does a lot to change the curve. Now, one thing that I think is really important to understand is when we talk about the accounting framework, we think that needs to be global in nature. Because if you're going to support global trade and compliance with multiple, frameworks, it's got to be consistent, comparable, all of that. But we do think that the intensity standards, that's for lawmakers at a country level to set, because everyone has a different mix with respect to what they're looking at, what the needs of their communities are. And so that's where you will likely see different curves, and you'll see different policymakers taking different approaches based on the individual needs of their countries. But as a whole, this should be a real tool to drive down emissions that is not in place today at a consistent level.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Amy, I know there's been a lot of activity on this set of topics internationally, including a newly announced partnership between GHGP and ISO. Can you tell me a little bit about how you plan to engage in that process moving forward?
Oh, Alexia, this question is so timely because we just got approved for our liaison status with ISO. And so what we had talked to ISO about is how do we provide transparency across the two efforts to see if we really are solving the same problem, then how do we drive the harmonization at the right point in time? And so we got approved for that. So we'll have full visibility into that work. We're in the process of forming our advisory committee, and we want to make sure that we've got representation on that advisory committee to the technical expert panel that will give the cross visibility so that we've got transparency across both efforts.
Well, Amy, this time has flown by.
It has.
Really appreciate the conversation and the candor. What should we expect next from Carbon Measures, and how can people get engaged?
So when you look at where we are, we launched, we've grown membership, we've hired our team, and now the work is beginning. And so keep an eye on us with respect to the work product that we deliver. So it'll be the landscape analysis coming out of the technical expert panel. It will be the principles by which we think need to be followed in order to underpin what we're looking to underpin. It'll be a draft framework of the accounting policies. And then it'll be a roadmap for what we think adoption looks like. And we will be transparent in the process. So we will seek input from others into that, not just the people on the expert panel. And then we'll be putting out work with respect to this techno-economic modeling that we think needs to be done to underpin the policy work. And I'm sure there's more that we'll be sharing beyond that. But I would love to come back, and I want you to hold me accountable. Like you said, you were going to move fast and not get in the way. Have you done that?
Well, you've certainly been moving fast. I've been watching closely and really impressed at how quickly you've built the team and started to put things in place. And I'm very hopeful that we can really work to align and start to bring this set of rulemaking exercises together so that we're really talking with each other and not past each other. Because in our shared objective of driving down emissions, we really need to be as aligned as we possibly can, because the fragmentation and the infighting, it is hurting us badly, and we don't have time.
We don't have time, and I agree with you entirely. So I think what's really important is, like we've both talked about, there's so much complexity to this, and there is an and. We need really well-functioning carbon markets, right? Yeah. We need reduction in the carbon emissions associated with these products that are needed to provide energy to the world. We need to make sure that there's profit along with transition. And so I think as long as we're all really clear on what is the problem that we're trying to tackle to solve, like each of us, right? What is the space that we're all going to move really fast on? And then what are the intersection points that we need to make sure we're doing? I think that could help us move forward in a faster way. And then there shouldn't be infighting. I know that we have to demonstrate that we are in this and fully committed in an authentic way. And I get that. But at the same time, the infighting doesn't help anyone, because there are a whole lot of forces that we're trying to navigate. And we need to make sure that we're focused on the big picture. So from a carbon measure standpoint, our goal is to be wildly collaborative so that we help drive that forward and do our part.
Well, that is my mantra as well. So last question. What is getting you up in the morning and keeping you excited about the work?
So I feel like I've been given this gift of being able to apply the skills and capabilities that I've developed over my 30-year career and be wholly focused on using them in order to drive global impact. And so that is what gets me up every day, is thinking about how am I going to use this great privilege I have in order to drive change. And so far, that has been enough because, as you know, I've been traveling all over the world and working quite a bit. So,
well, thank you so much for joining me here today. Thanks for the excellent discussion and looking forward to following up in a few months.
Sounds good. We'll be in touch.
Thanks so much, Amy.
Thank you.
That's a wrap on this special episode of Navigating Net Zero. If you enjoyed the conversation, please be sure to follow or subscribe, and help us spread the word by sharing this episode with your friends or colleagues. Thank you again for listening. Until next time, take good care and keep up the fight.